This HOA Karen arrested herself with pure stupidity. Nancy smashed my ranch gun safe with a sledgehammer at 3 a.m., literally breaking it into pieces. Then called 911, screaming about weapons. Federal agents swarmed in, fast guns, drawn but minutes. Later they had her in cuffs. How, when she broke into my safe hunting for guns, she accidentally revealed something that made the FBI go. Finally, 5 years of searching what was in my safe that turned a simple HOA complaint into a federal takedown. Comment WTF, because this karma is delicious. Moving to Pine Ranch was supposed to be my escape from city drama. After 20 years of dealing with noisy neighbors and cramped apartments, I'd finally saved enough to buy a small ranch property on the outskirts of town. The previous owner, an old rancher named Bill, threw in a massive 300-kilogram safe as part of the deal used to store hunting rifles back in the day. He'd said, pointing to the faded ranch armory lettering on its side, "I haven't used it in 20 years, but it's bolted to the concrete, more trouble to remove than it's worth. I didn't need it for guns, since I didn't own any, but it was perfect for storing my most valuable possessions, $50,000 worth of Brazilian rosewood and my late father's antique woodworking tools. The wood alone was irreplaceable, legally imported decades ago, when regulations were different and so sensitive to humidity that improper storage could ruin it in weeks. First sign of trouble came exactly 3 days after I moved in. I was in my workshop carefully arranging the rosewood and the climate-controlled safe when I noticed movement outside the window. There she was, Nancy Whitaker, standing on her property line with a pair of binoculars aimed directly at my workshop. At first I thought maybe she was bird-watching, but the way she frantically scribbled notes while staring at my safe told a different story. I'd met Nancy briefly at the welcoming committee visit. The day I arrived, she'd handed me a 3-in thick HOA rulebook with certain sections already highlighted in yellow, particularly the ones about maintaining neighborhood safety and reporting suspicious activities. Her husband, Tom, had stood behind her, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, occasionally nodding when she'd paused for breath. During her 20-minute lecture about proper lawn height that evening, my phone buzzed with an email from Nancy. The subject line read, "Urgent safety concern regarding your property." My stomach dropped as I opened it. She had attached photos of my safe taken through my workshop window, with red circles drawn around the ranch armory. Text. Her message was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive paranoia. "Dear Mr. Carter," it began. "As HOA president, it's my duty to ensure the safety of all Pine Ranch residents. I couldn't help but notice you've installed what appears to be a military-grade weapons storage unit in your workshop. While I'm sure you have permits for whatever arsenal you're storing, I must remind you that our community has strict guidelines about firearms. Perhaps we should discuss this at our next HOA meeting." I stared at the email in disbelief. Arsenal, military grade. It was just an old safe. I typed a polite response explaining that I was a woodworker, not a gun collector, and the safe merely stored valuable lumber and tools. NY's response came within minutes. "Mr. Carter, I find it concerning that you're being evasive about the contents of your weapons safe. The words Ranch Armory are clearly visible. I've been HOA president for 15 years, and I know when someone is hiding something. This will be addressed at Tuesday's meeting. I realized then that reasoning with her was pointless. She'd already decided I was some kind of armed threat to the neighborhood. What I didn't know yet was that NY's paranoia about safes ran much deeper than typical HOA nosiness. During her bitter divorce 5 years earlier, her ex-husband had hidden $200,000 in a similar safe money the court never found. Since then, every safe was suspicious, every new neighbor a potential threat, and every ranch armory label a red flag that triggered her obsessive need for control. The HOA meeting that Tuesday was a masterclass in manipulation. Nancy had prepared a full PowerPoint presentation titled Neighborhood Security Threats, complete with zoomed-in photos of my safe from multiple angles. She'd even added ominous sound effects when transitioning between slides. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced to the room of about 30 neighbors, we have a situation. Our new neighbor, Ethan Carter, has installed what can only be described as a weapons vault in his workshop. She clicked to a slide showing the safe, with dramatic red arrows pointing to the ranch armory text. Now, I'm not saying Mr. Carter is dangerous, but can we really afford to take chances? What if he's storing automatic weapons? What if children wander onto his property? The room erupted in murmurs. I tried to explain that it was just storage for woodworking materials, but Nancy cut me off. That's exactly what someone hiding weapons would. Most neighbors seemed skeptical of NY's dramatics, but a few were nodding along. Tom had fallen asleep in his chair and suddenly jerked awake, accidentally clapping at the worst possible moment when Nancy declared we must take action. The room went silent. Then a few people chuckled and Y's face turned crimson. Tom, pay attention. This is serious. Sofia Alvarez, an older woman who lived 2 houses down from me, was taking notes in a small leather journal. She caught my eye and gave me the slightest shake of her head, as if to say, don't worry about this nonsense. But I was worried. I'd moved here for peace, not to become the neighborhood pariah over a misunderstanding about an old safe. After the meeting, I called Sheriff Brooks, hoping to get ahead of whatever Nancy was planning. Let me guess, he said. With a heavy sigh, Nancy Whitaker is causing problems again. Apparently, I wasn't her first target. Look, Mr. Carter, unless she actually does something illegal, it's just neighbors being neighbors. Document everything. Install some cameras if you're worried. But try not to let her get to UNY's. Been like this ever since her divorce. She sees threats everywhere. But as I hung up the phone, staring out at my workshop where $50,000 worth of irreplaceable wood sat in that controversial safe, I had a sinking feeling that Nancy wasn't going to let this go. That night, I dreamed about Nancy breaking into my workshop with a crowbar, her eyes wild with determination. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. Little did I know that my nightmare was about to become reality, and that NY's obsession with my safe would eventually lead to her downfall and the exposure of something much bigger than either of us could have imagined. The decision to install security cameras turned out to be the smartest move I'd ever made. I spent the entire next day setting up a 4,000 system with night vision and audio recording capabilities around my workshop. If Nancy wants to play games, I muttered, while adjusting the last camera angle, I'll make sure I have a front row seat to whatever she's planning. The cameras were small but powerful, with motion sensors that would alert my phone if anyone came within 20 feet of the workshop after hours. I even installed one inside, aimed directly at the safe. As I tested the system that evening, I noticed something odd on the playback. Nancy had walked by my property line 17 times that day, each time pausing to stare at my workshop. On the 15th pass, she was on her phone, gesticulating wildly. The audio picked up fragments. Definitely weapons, ranch armory, just like Rogers, safe Roger. I learned later was her ex-husband. 3 nights later, at exactly 3:17 a.m., my phone exploded with motion alerts. I groggily opened the app, and what I saw made me instantly wide awake. Nancy Whitaker was in my workshop, dressed in all black like some kind of demented cat burglar, wielding a 10 kilograms sledgehammer. The infrared camera captured everything in eerie green detail as she positioned herself in front of my safe. Then, in what might be the creepiest thing I've ever witnessed, she started singing "Every Breath You Take" while raising the hammer. Every breath you take, every move you make, slam. The hammer connected with the safe door. Every bond you break, every step you take, slam. I'll be watching you. Slam, slam. She swung with the fury of a woman possessed, grunting between verses. After about 10 minutes of relentless pounding, she managed to crack open a corner of the safe door. She pressed her face to the opening, using her phone's flashlight to peer inside. Wood. It's just wood. And Y's scream of frustration echoed through the workshop. She dropped the sledgehammer, clutching her lower back. There has to be more. There has to be, she tried, prying the opening wider, with her hands breaking 3 acrylic nails in the process. Damn it, these cost $70. At that moment, Tom appeared in the doorway with a flashlight, looking confused and half asleep. Nancy, what are you doing? It's 3 o'clock in the morning. Nancy spun around, her eyes wild. Go back to bed. Tom, I'm handling the situation. Tom looked at the damaged safe, the scattered nails, the sledgehammer on the floor. Instead of being shocked, he just shook his head and started counting under his breath. 53, 54, that's enough. I couldn't understand what he meant by the counting, but Nancy didn't seem to notice. Tom, I said, go home. She shrieked. Tom shuffled away, but the camera caught him pulling out his phone as he left in her panic to leave. Nancy knocked over my workbench, sending tools clattering across the floor. Up, she grabbed her sledgehammer, but left her phone behind, which had fallen under the destroyed workbench. As she fled, she ran directly into my lawn sprinkler, triggering the motion sensor. The sprinklers drenched her from head to toe, and she let out a string of profanities that would make a sailor blush. The entire catastrophe was captured in beautiful high-definition video with crystal-clear audio. I sat in my bed, watching the footage in real time, torn between calling the police immediately or waiting to see what Nancy would do next. I decided to wait until morning and make copies of everything first. Something told me this evidence was going to be crucial, and I needed to protect it. At 6 o'clock a.m. I went to survey the damage. The safe door was partially caved in, but still functional. NY's phone lay under the workbench, its screen cracked, but still working. I probably should have left it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. The phone wasn't password protected, which seemed careless for someone so paranoid. Her recent texts made my blood run cold. The most recent thread was with someone saved as management. Pine Ranch assessment in progress. Target has large, safe-marked ranch armory. Proceeding with standard protocol. The response, excellent. Pine Valley, Oakwood, and Riverside operations all yielded successful property devaluations. Ensure documentation before enforcement action. My hands shook as I scrolled up the texts, went back. Months discussing targets and property values and HOA enforcement resulting in distress sales. I screenshot everything and emailed it to myself from her phone, then placed it in a plastic bag. This was bigger than just Nancy being a nightmare neighbor. She was part of something organized, something that had apparently hit multiple neighborhoods. But before I could process this revelation, I heard a car door slam outside. Nancy was back, marching up my driveway with her spare phone in hand, Tom trailing behind her. "I know you have my phone, Carter," she yelled, before even reaching my door. "Hand it over now, or I'll call the police and tell them you stole it." I opened the door holding the bagged phone. "Absolutely, Nancy. I found it in my workshop. By the way, how did it get there?" Her face went pale, then red, then purple. You must have taken it. You lured me in there." Tom spoke up from behind her. "Nancy, stop. Just stop." But Nancy was already spiraling. "I have evidence you're hiding weapons. I took photos. The police will believe me over some stranger who just moved here." He waved her spare phone triumphantly. "The HOA board stands behind me." His phone slightly and mouthed what looked like 54 again. What was he counting? I went back inside and reviewed all my footage again. Illegal or crazy, Tom would count and make a note in his phone he'd been documenting her behavior patterns. The revelation hit me like a sledgehammer to my own safe. Tom wasn't the oblivious husband he appeared to be. He was gathering evidence just like I was, but evidence for what and why. As I backed up the videos to 3 separate USB drives and uploaded copies to the cloud, I had a sinking feeling that NY's 3 a.m. safe-mashing adventure was just the beginning. Whatever scheme she was running with this management was about to collide, hidden with whatever Tom was planning, and somehow I was caught right in the middle. I spent that night backing up every piece of evidence, knowing that whatever was coming next would happen fast. Nancy wasn't the type to back down, and with her phone recovered, she'd be desperate to control the narrative. I had no idea just how desperate she'd become. The next morning brought a new level of insanity that I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams. I was reviewing the security footage for the 10th time when I noticed something that made my coffee mug freeze halfway to my lips. On one of the cameras facing the street, I could see directly into NY's home office window. She was hunched over her computer, and when I zoomed in on the high-resolution footage, editing the blurry photos she'd taken inside my safe, I watched in disbelief as she carefully placed images of AK-47s, ammunition boxes, and what looked like grenades among my expensive wood collection. "Holy," I whispered, "she's actually fabricating evidence." The timestamp showed this was happening right now at 8:43 a.m. I grabbed my phone to record her computer screen through my security camera, creating evidence of her creating false evidence. The irony wasn't lost on me. 20 minutes into her Photoshop session, Nancy stood up and began what I can only describe as a rehearsal performance. She positioned herself in front of a full-length mirror and started practicing different emergency call voices. Her head unsatisfied. Next was the tearful victim. "I'm so scared. My neighbor has weapons," he said. "He'd hurt my family if I told anyone." Still not quite right. Finally, she tried righteous anger. "I am Nancy Whitaker, HOA, president of Pine Ranch. I demand you send units immediately." She seemed to like this one, but decided to combine all 3 approaches. For 15 minutes, she practiced her performance, adjusting her tone, adding strategic pauses, even working out where to insert believable sobs. I recorded every second of it, my jaw hanging open at the calculated manipulation. At exactly 9:30 a.m., Nancy made her move through the security cameras. I watched her pace, her living room phone in hand, taking deep breaths like an actress about to go on stage. Then she dialed 911. "What's your emergency?" NY's performance was Oscar-worthy. "My name is Nancy Whitaker. I'm the HOA president at Pine Ranch Estates. My neighbor Ethan Carter has an illegal weapons cache. I have photographic evidence. He's storing military-grade weapons in a safe marked ranch armory." Her voice crescendoed perfectly from concerned citizen to terrified victim. I confronted him about it, for the safety of our children. "And he threatened to kill me. He said he'd burn down my house if I reported him. Please, I'm so scared. He's unstable and armed." She even managed to work in some convincing sobs between sentences. The operator asked for details, and Nancy delivered her rehearsed lines flawlessly, adding that I was a loner who just moved here and act suspicious around children, which was particularly offensive since I'd barely left my workshop since arriving. The response was swift and overwhelming. Within 12 minutes, my quiet street looked like a scene from an action movie. FBI vehicles, ATF units, and what appeared to be a SWAT team surrounded my property. I was in my backyard, ironically planting tomatoes and trying to feel normal when I heard the first officer on the bullhorn. "Ethan Carter, come out with your hands visible. We have the property surrounded." My hands instinctively shot up, still holding a small garden trop. "Drop the weapon," someone shouted. Even in that terrifying moment, part of me wanted to laugh. A garden trop was now a weapon. I dropped it and walked slowly toward the officer's hands, high above my head. "I'm unarmed," I called out, my voice surprisingly steady. "There's been a misunderstanding. I have security footage that explains everything." Special Agent Miller of the FBI stepped forward, his hand resting on his service weapon. "Mr. Carter, we received a credible threat report involving illegal weapons and threats of violence. We need to search your property." I nodded, staying calm. "Despite my racing heart, I understand, Agent Miller. But before you do, may I show you something on my phone? It's directly relevant to why you're here." "My phone? This is security footage from this morning," I explained, pulling up the video of NY's Photoshop session. "And this is from 3 nights ago." I showed them Nancy breaking into my workshop with a sledgehammer, her demented singing the safe. "Damage everything but the Cupra" was the rehearsal footage. As NY's practice performance played, I saw Agent Miller's expression shift from suspicion to understanding to anger. "Wait a minute," Agent Miller said, zooming in on the Photoshop screen. "In the footage, she's adding weapons to photos." He pulled out his own phone and showed it to another agent. "Isn't this the woman from the Pine Valley case, and Oakwood and Riverside?" My heart jumped. They already knew about those other neighborhoods. The other agent nodded slowly. "Holy, it is. We've been tracking false HOA complaints that led to mass property devaluations in those areas. Same pattern every time. Weapons allegations, police raids, property values tank, mysterious buyers scoop up homes for pennies on the dollar." Agent Miller turned back to me. "Mr. Carter, I think you just helped us crack a case we've been working on for 2 years. Just then, Nancy appeared at the edge of my property, waving her printed Photoshop masterpieces. "Officers, I have the evidence right here. photos. From inside his weapon safe, she was still in character, playing the terrified victim, clutching Tom's arm for support. Tom, I noticed, looked unusually calm for someone whose spouse had just reported a dangerous armed neighbor. Agent Miller walked over to Nancy, his expression neutral. Ma'am, we'll need to see those photos. Nancy handed them over eagerly, her face a mask of civic concern. I took these at great personal risk. He's dangerous. You can see the assault rifles, the ammunition, the grenades. Agent Miller examined the photos carefully, then pulled out a small device. Mrs. Whitaker, are you aware that digital photos contain metadata? NY's face twitched slightly. And what these photos show, digital manipulation timestamps from he checked his device 47 minutes ago. They were edited on a computer, registered to Nancy Whitaker. The color drained from NY's face like water from a bathtub. That's impossible. You're reading it wrong. Tom stepped forward, then his voice different from the mumbling, sleepy persona I'd witnessed before. Actually, Agent Miller, it's quite possible. Nancy, why don't you tell them about Pine Valley or Oakwood or Riverside? Nancy spun on him, her careful performance crumbling. Tom, what are you doing? Tom pulled out his phone with a slight smile. 54 times, Nancy. 54 times in 2 years. You've broken into neighbors' properties. I've documented every single incident. The silence that followed was deafening. Nancy looked between Tom, the agents, and me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Agent Miller stepped closer to Nancy. Mrs. Whitaker, I'm going to need you to come with us for questioning. And just like that, the entire dynamic flipped. The weapons-obsessed neighbor who'd called in an emergency was now the one being led away by federal agents. But as Nancy passed by me, she leaned in close and whispered something that made my blood run cold. You have no idea what you've just done. This is so much bigger than you think. Before I could respond, she was in the back of an FBI vehicle, and Tom was standing there looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The federal agents were thorough but professional as they processed my property. Agent Miller had quickly shifted from treating me as a suspect to recognizing me as a witness in something much larger. Mr. Carter, he said, standing in my workshop while examining the damaged safe. We need to verify the contents of this safe, but I want to assure you that you're not under investigation. In fact, you may have accidentally helped us solve a major case. I nodded and worked the combination, my hands slightly shaking from the adrenaline. The damaged door creaked open, revealing exactly what I'd told everyone from the beginning. Stacks of Brazilian rosewood worth $50. $0 each piece, carefully wrapped and labeled. My father's antique woodworking tools in their original leather cases and a thick folder. Hands, what's this? I shrugged, genuinely puzzled. I'm not sure it came with the safe. When I bought the property from Bill, I never bothered to look. As Miller opened the folder, his eyes went wide. He quickly flipped through pages, his expression growing more serious with each document. Mr. Carter, do you know Sofia Alvarez? The question caught me off guard. The woman from the HOA meeting. I mean, I've seen her around. From a federal investigation, Sofia Alvarez versus Nancy Whitaker and Pine Ranch Estates, LLC. This case is from 5 years ago. Just then, as if summoned by her name, Sofia appeared at my workshop door, escorted by another agent. But this wasn't the quiet, note-taking neighbor I'd seen at the HOA meeting. This Sofia stood straighter, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Hello, Ethan," Sophia said with a slight smile. "I apologize for the deception, but I needed you to play your role naturally." I stared at her pieces of a puzzle I didn't know existed, starting to form a picture. What role? What deception? Sophia walked over to the safe, glancing at the folder in Miller's hands. 5 years ago, Nancy Whitaker destroyed my life. I was a federal prosecutor, not retired. Like I told everyone, Nancy orchestrated a fake weapons complaint against my son, claiming he was stockpiling arms in our garage. The raid, the media covered the legal fees. It ruined us. My son lost his security clearance, his job, everything. I lost my life savings fighting the false charges. By the time we were cleared, the damage was done. Property values in our area had plummeted. And guess who bought up half the neighborhood through shell companies, Nancy? I breathed the scope of this hitting me. Sophia nodded grimly. Nancy and her associates. I spent 3 years gathering evidence, tracking her pattern across neighborhoods. Pine Valley, Oakwood, Riverside, and now Pine Ranch. Always the same method. Target a resident, preferably a newcomer, or someone vulnerable. Make false weapons allegations, trigger a raid, tank property values. Then mysterious cash buyers appear, offering to help distressed. This independently, but we could never catch them in the act. The complaints always seemed legitimate enough. The photographic evidence was getting more sophisticated, and by the time we'd investigate, the economic damage was done. So you used me as bait, I said, understanding dawning. Sophia had the grace to look apologetic when I heard Nancy discussing the new resident with the ranch armory safe at the HOA meeting. I knew she wouldn't be able to resist. You were perfect, a single man new to the area with a legitimate safe that had a provocative name. I made sure to act supportive but distant, knowing Nancy would escalate if she thought you were isolated. Part of me wanted to be angry at being used, but the larger part was fascinated by the elaborate sting. What about Tom? I asked. Is he part of this? At that, Tom himself entered the workshop, and the transformation was remarkable. Gone was the sleepy, henpecked husband. This Tom stood tall, spoke clearly, and had an unmistakable bearing of authority. Special Agent Tom Morrison, FBI, undercover, he said, showing his credentials. 2 years ago, we placed me in Inwy's life after tracking suspicious property transactions. Becoming her husband was challenging but necessary to gather evidence. From inside the organization, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. You married her for a case. Tom's expression was woeful. The things we do for justice. Do you have any idea how many times I had to pretend to fall asleep during her HOA presentations, or act confused when she'd sneak out at night? The counting thing was my way of staying sane, documenting every criminal act while maintaining my cover. He pulled out his phone, showing an app with hundreds of audio files, 2 years of recorded conversations. Nancy, discussing targets, planning false evidence, coordinating with her partners. She thought I was too stupid to understand what she was saying. Agent Miller was examining more documents from the folder. This is incredible financial records, property transactions, even email chains between Nancy and her associates. How did these end up in your safe, Mr. Carter? I thought back to Bill, the previous owner. Bill sold me this place in a hurry, said he needed to move for health reasons. He mentioned the safe came with the property from an even earlier owner. Maybe someone hid these documents here years ago. Sophia stepped forward. Or maybe Bill knew exactly what he was leaving for the next owner. He called me before selling, said he was leaving a gift for whoever Nancy targeted next. I think he knew the safe would draw her attention. The piece that had been nagging at me suddenly clicked. The text messages on NY's phone mentioned management, who's actually running this operation. Tom's expression darkened. That's what we're about to find out. NY's in custody, and she's looking at serious federal charges. Need to take this evidence, and we'll need your testimony, but I want you to know you've helped expose a criminal organization that's destroyed dozens of families across 5 states. Your security footage of Nancy fabricating evidence is the smoking gun we've been looking for. As the agents began cataloging evidence and preparing to leave, I looked around my damaged workshop, my violated safe, my disrupted life. So what happens now? I asked. Sophia placed a hand on my shoulder. Now, Ethan, we make sure Nancy and her associates pay for every family they've destroyed, and you get to be the hero who brought them down, even if you didn't mean to. Tom added with a slight smile. Plus, you'll have one hell of a story to tell, how I accidentally helped the FBI catch a $50 million real estate fraud ring. Would make a great dinner party anecdote. Despite everything, I found myself laughing. Here, I'd moved to Pine Ranch for peace and quiet, and instead, I'd stumbled into a federal investigation. But as I watched Nancy being driven away in custody through my workshop window, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't expected. Sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. The FBI operation that followed was something out of a movie, and I had a front row seat to the whole spectacular collapse of NY's criminal empire. Within hours of her arrest, Agent Miller had set up a mobile command center in my driveway, and I watched in amazement as coordinated raids happened simultaneously across multiple states. The large monitor in the command vehicle showed feeds from body cameras as FBI agents swept into offices, homes, and HOA meetings. Target Alpha, secured in Phoenix. One voice crackled through the speakers. Target Bravo, in custody in Denver. Another reported Miami team has secured Target Charlie in all financial records. Each target was another HOA president or board member who'd been part of NY's network, and the evidence Tom had gathered over 2 years was the roadmap leading agents to every single one of them. Nancy herself was in an interrogation room at the federal building, and Tom had invited me to watch the feed from an observation area. I'd never seen someone's carefully constructed world crumble so completely. Nancy sat across from Agent Miller. Her perfect HOA president appearance disheveled her expressions cycling between defiance and desperation. I want a lawyer, she kept repeating, but Miller calmly continued laying out evidence, photos of her Photoshop session, audio of her practicing her 911 call, videos of her 54 documented break-ins, financial records showing kickbacks from property sales. The pile of evidence was overwhelming, Mrs. Whitaker Miller said, sliding a document across the table. We have confirmation of 47 neighborhoods across 5 states where your organization operated. Conservative estimates put the total fraud at over $50 million. You can cooperate and potentially see reduced charges, or you can face the full weight of federal prosecution alone. NY's lawyer, a nervous-looking man who'd arrived within an hour, was whispering urgently in her ear. But Nancy wasn't listening. She was staring at the monitor on the wall, showing Tom in the observation room. You bastard, she said quietly, her voice carrying through the audio feed. 2 years of marriage, and it was all a lie. Tom leaned forward to speak into the intercom. The marriage was real, Nancy legally binding in everything. The feelings not so much. By the way, remember all those times you called me an idiot who couldn't understand your business calls? I understood every word, documented them to Inwise, face contorted with rage. I'll destroy you. You think you've won. You have no idea what you've started. But her threats rang hollow as Agent Miller produced more evidence, including recordings of her discussing the management team and their expansion plans. The real bombshell came when they brought in one of NY's associates from Phoenix, a man named Richard Kellerman, who'd been running similar scams there. Unlike Nancy, Richard took one look at the evidence against him and immediately flipped. I'll tell you everything he said before his lawyer could stop him. Names, bank accounts, the whole structure. Just keep me out of maximum security. According to Richard, the organization had started small, with just a few corrupt HOA board members sharing tips on how to manipulate property values. But over 5 years, it had grown into a sophisticated operation with 52 active participants, a shared legal defense fund, and even a training manual for new recruits. Nancy, it turned out, was one of the founding members and had personally trained 15 other HOA presidents in the weapons threat property devaluation method, as they actually called it. In their internal documents, Sophia had been invited to observe as well. Given her role in the investigation, she watched NY's interrogation with grim satisfaction. 5 years, she said quietly. 5 years since she destroyed my family, and finally justice. She turned to me with an apologetic look. Ethan, I need to apologize again for using you as bait. When I heard about the ranch armory safe at that HOA meeting, I knew Nancy wouldn't be able to resist, but I should have warned you somehow. I shook my head, still processing everything. Honestly, Sophia, I'm just glad I could help, even if it was accidental. But why didn't you just have the FBI raid her earlier if you knew what she was doing, Agent Miller answered. That one, we needed her in the act of fabricating evidence. Your security footage of her creating those fake photos and rehearsing the emergency call is what makes this case airtight. Without that, a good lawyer could argue the previous incidents were misunderstandings or that evidence was planted, but nobody can argue with video of her literally photoshopping weapons into innocent photos. As the day wore on, more dominoes fell. The mysterious cash buyers who'd purchased distressed properties were revealed to be shell companies controlled by the HOA network. They'd buy homes at 30 to 40% below market value, then flip them once the neighborhood recovered from the weapons scare. Banks that had processed the transactions were scrambling to distance themselves. Real estate licenses were being revoked. Civil lawsuits were being filed by the hundreds. Tom pulled me aside during a break. You know, Ethan, in 2 years of living with Nancy, watching her destroy families for profit, I kept hoping someone like you would come along, someone who wouldn't just roll over when she started her games. When Sophia told me about you in that safe, I knew this was our chance. He paused, looking tired. Do you have any idea what it's like pretending to be married to someone like that? Every night, listening to her celebrate destroying another family, while I had to play dumb. The most satisfying moment came when they played Nancy. The full recording of her management conference call. 23 HOA presidents and board members had been on the call discussing their fourth quarter targets, like they were running a legitimate business. They'd actually assigned territories and quotas with bonuses for whoever could tank. Property values. The fastest NY's face went white as she heard her own voice saying, "Remember, the key is to make the weapon's threat believable. Photos help, but nothing beats a hysterical 911 call. I'll send everyone my new script template after this call." Her lawyer finally spoke up. "My client will consider a cooperation agreement in exchange for sentencing considerations." But the damage was done. The FBI had everything they needed. By evening, the news had broken nationally. FBI busts, massive HOA fraud ring dominated headlines. My phone was buzzing non-stop with calls from reporters, but Agent Miller advised me not to speak to media yet. "Let's get through the legal proceedings first," he said. "Your testimony is going to be crucial." As I stood in my workshop that night, looking at my damaged safe and thinking about how a simple move to the countryside had led to all this, NY's transport van drove past my house one final time. Through the window, I could see her staring at me, her expression unreadable. Then she mouthed something that looked like, "This isn't over." But as the van disappeared and FBI agents continued processing evidence in my driveway, I knew she was wrong. For Nancy Whitaker and her criminal network, it was very much over. The trial of Nancy Whitaker and her co-conspirators became one of the most watched federal cases of the year. 6 months after that chaotic morning, when FBI agents had surrounded my property, I found myself in a federal courthouse, dressed in my only suit, preparing to testify. The prosecution had built an airtight case, but my security footage and testimony were considered the linchpin. "Just tell the truth." The prosecutor had advised me. "The evidence speaks for itself." As I walked into the courtroom, I saw Nancy sitting at the defense table. The confident HOA president who terrorized neighborhoods for profit was gone. In her place sat a diminished woman whose empire had crumbled. She'd lost weight. Her perfect hair was now gray at the roots, and the designer clothes had been replaced with a simple courtroom-appropriate dress. But when her eyes met, I still saw that flash of malice that had started this whole saga. Tom testified before me, and his transformation on the witness stand was remarkable. Gone was any trace of the bumbling husband act special agent. Morrison detailed 2 years of undercover work with the precision and clarity of a seasoned professional. The defendant would often conduct her planning sessions late at night, believing I was asleep. He testified he'd review target profiles, practice emergency call scripts, and coordinate with other members of the network. I documented 943 hours of incriminating conversations. The defense tried to paint Tom as a vindictive ex-husband, but when he produced recordings of Nancy laughing about a family forced into bankruptcy, saying they should have just minded their own business, even the jury looked disgusted. When my turn came to testify, I simply told the truth: how I'd moved to Pine Ranch seeking peace, how Nancy had fixated on my safe from day one, how she'd broken into my workshop with a sledgehammer while singing "Every Breath You Take," which actually got a few shocked laughs from the gallery. But the most damaging testimony came when I described finding the text messages on her phone about management and the systematic targeting of neighborhood. The prosecutor then played my security footage on the courtroom screens. Watching Nancy methodically Photoshop weapons into photos of my safe while practicing her fake emergency call was devastating to her defense. Even her own lawyer seemed to deflate as the evidence played out. Sophia's testimony provided the historical context the jury needed. She explained how NY's scheme had destroyed her family 5 years earlier, and how she'd spent years tracking the pattern across neighborhoods. The defendant didn't just commit fraud, Sophia said, her voice steady but emotional. She weaponized the American dream. She turned neighbor against neighbor, used fear to destroy communities, all for profit. My son still can't get security clearance because of the false allegations. She orchestrated the stigma follows these families forever. When the defense tried to cross-examine Sophia, suggesting she was merely seeking revenge, she calmly produced 5 years of meticulous documentation. This isn't about revenge, she said. It's about stopping a predator who viewed American families as nothing more than profit opportunities. The trial took 3 weeks, but the jury deliberated for only 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy, filing false reports, and 43 other charges. Nancy stood stone-faced as the verdict was read, but I saw her hands shaking. Her lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, probably discussing appeals, but Nancy wasn't listening. She was staring at the gallery full of her victims, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of destruction she'd caused for someone who'd spent years manipulating the system. Watching that same system turn against her must have been devastating. The court clerk read each guilty count with deliberate precision, and with each one Nancy seemed to shrink further into herself. By the time they reached count 46, she was barely recognizable as the imperious HOA president who terrorized neighborhoods for profit. The judge, a stern woman who'd seemed horrified by the evidence throughout the trial, scheduled sentencing for the following month. NY's co-conspirators fell like dominoes after that. Faced with the prospect of decades in federal prison, most took plea deals. The full scope of the organization was staggering: 52 active participants, 417 affected neighborhoods, over 3,000 families directly harmed, and more than $50 million in fraudulent profits. A month later, I returned for NY's sentencing. The courtroom was packed with victims from across the country, families whose lives had been destroyed by her scheme. One by one, they gave impact statements. A teacher who'd lost her home in Pine Valley, a veteran whose PTSD was triggered by the SWAT raid Nancy had orchestrated in Oakwood, a small business owner who'd gone bankrupt fighting false charges in Riverside. The judge listened to 2 hours of testimony about destroyed lives and stolen dreams. When Nancy was given the chance to speak, she stood and turned not to the judge, but to me. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice hollow, "I hope you're satisfied. You've destroyed everything I built." The judge immediately interjected, "Mrs. Whitaker, you destroyed what you built the moment you decided to profit from innocent families' misery." The sentence was harsh, but justified: 24 years in federal prison, $5 million in restitution to victims, and a lifetime ban from serving on any HOA or community board. As Nancy was led away in handcuffs, she passed by where I sat with Tom and Sophia. For a moment she paused, and I expected another threat or bitter comment. Instead, she just looked tired and defeated. "That's safe," she said quietly. "It really did just have wood in it." I nodded. "Brazilian rosewood, worth a lot, but completely legal. No weapons, no secrets, just wood and tools." She actually laughed, a broken sound. 24 years, because I couldn't believe someone just had wood in a safe marked ranch armory. Then she was gone, led away to begin serving nearly a quarter century behind bars outside the courthouse. Victims and Their families gathered, many approached to thank me, which felt surreal since I'd essentially stumbled into heroism by accident. You gave us justice. The teacher from Pine Valley said, tears in her eyes, we'd given up hope of ever seeing Nancy pay for what she did. Tom found me in the crowd, now officially divorced from Nancy, and his undercover assignment complete. He looked years younger. Thank you, Ethan, he said, shaking my hand. I know you didn't ask for any of this, but you handled it with grace. Not everyone would have stayed strong when federal agents were pointing guns at them. Ophia was there to finally looking at peace after 5 years of seeking justice. The FBI is recommending you for a civilian commination. She told me you accidentally did what dozens of agents couldn't. You caught Nancy in the act and gave us the evidence to bring down the entire network. As I drove home to Pine Ranch that afternoon, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. I'd left the city seeking simple pleasures, woodworking in peace, quiet mornings with coffee, maybe some vegetable gardening instead. I'd become the accidental catalyst for one of the largest HOA fraud busts in FBI history. My workshop still bore scars from NY's sledgehammer assault, and my safe door would never close quite right again. But as I pulled into my driveway and saw my neighbors wave genuinely friendly, now that NY's reign of terror was over, I realized I'd found something better than peace and quiet. I'd found a community free from fear, and I'd played a part in making that happen. Sometimes the best victories are the ones you never plan to fight for. Ending. 300 words, and that's the wild story of how Nancy Whitaker, the HOA president from hell, thought she could outsmart everyone, but ended up outsmarting herself right into federal prison from an old safe with faded ranch armory. Lettering to a 24-year sentence, NY's greed and paranoia were her own downfall. The lesson here is simple. Never underestimate anyone. Nancy thought I was just a harmless woodworker. Tom was just a dozy husband, and Sophia was just a quiet retiree. But together we brought down a $50 million criminal enterprise. These days, Pine Ranch is a different place. Sophia serves as our new HOA president, and her first act was to dissolve every ridiculous rule Nancy had implemented. Tom drops by occasionally, finally free to be himself after 2 years of undercover work. He's writing a book about the experience, though he jokes that nobody would believe it's nonfiction. As for me, I'm still in my workshop, still storing expensive wood in that beat-up old safe, but now it has a new addition, a small plaque that reads, "This safe helped save 47 neighborhoods." Not bad for something that just stored lumber. The FBI did give me that civilian combination which sits on my workbench between my father's tools and my coffee mug. Reporters still call occasionally, wanting to retell the story of the accidental hero who exposed the HOA mafia. But I'm done with fame. I got what I came to Pine Ranch for in the first place: peace, quiet, and the ability to work with wood without drama. Though I must admit, the story does make for one hell of an icebreaker at a party. Sometimes people ask if I regret getting involved, if I wish I just moved somewhere else when Nancy started her harassment. But then I think about those 417 families who finally got justice, and I know I was exactly where I needed to be. So remember, next time your HOA president seems a little too interested in your business, maybe install some security cameras. You never know when you might accidentally help the FBI catch a major crime ring. And if you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and drop a comment about your own crazy neighbor experiences. Trust me, after Nancy Whitaker, I've heard it all, but I still love reading your stories. Until next time, this is Ethan Carter, saying sometimes the best safe is one that just holds what it's supposed to hold, nothing more, nothing less. Peace out, and keep your security cameras rolling. If this video made you say,